At 23:47 on November 14, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery gripped the throttles of PT-59 as three Japanese Daihatsu barges materialized from the darkness off Savo Island. 32 years old. 21 night patrols since August. 0 barges sunk. The barges carried ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements for Japanese positions threatening Guadalcanal. Each barge mounted a Type 92 heavy machine gun and steel armor plates designed to deflect small arms fire. Montgomery had 4 Mark 8 torpedoes. Each torpedo required 10 feet of water to arm and stabilize. The Daihatsu barges drew barely 4 feet. His torpedoes would pass harmlessly beneath them. By mid-November 1942, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had fired 73 torpedoes at Japanese barges. Confirmed hits, 0. The pattern was maddening. PT boats raced in at 40 knots, torpedoes launched. White wakes streaked toward targets. Then, nothing. The torpedoes dove, ran deep, and disappeared into the Black Pacific while barges continued unmolested. Return fire forced the PT boats to retreat. 3 boats burned. 8 sailors died. The twin 50 caliber Browning machine guns on PT-59 could fire 850 rounds per minute. Against wooden sampans, lethal. Against armored Daihatsu barges, useless. The rounds sparked and ricocheted off steel plate. Japanese gunners didn't even flinch. The Japanese called it the Rat Run. Nightly barge convoys slipping down the slot between islands. When American aircraft made destroyer missions suicidal, Tokyo switched to barges. Smaller, slower, nearly invisible to radar, and completely immune to PT boat torpedoes. Squadron commanders at Tulagi were running out of options. Some crews had jury-rigged single-shot 37mm anti-tank guns onto their bows. Army M3s, with wheels removed, lashed to timber platforms with steel cable. One shot, then manual reload while enemy tracers lit up the night. Better than nothing, but barely. The real problem was mathematics. Each barge carried 60 troops or 8 tons of supplies. The Japanese ran 25 to 30 barges per night past Guadalcanal. To disrupt enemy logistics, PT boats needed to sink multiple barges per patrol. Single-shot weapons couldn't deliver that kind of sustained firepower. Henderson Field sat 2 miles inland from Lunga Point. Marines had seized the airstrip on August 7th. By November, it resembled an aircraft boneyard. Wrecked planes lined the runway perimeter and taxiways. Japanese bombers hit Henderson almost daily. Betty bombers escorted by Zeros. The Americans scrambled everything flyable. Some aircraft returned damaged and crashed on landing. Some never returned at all. Dozens of Bell P-39 era Cobra fighters lay scattered around Henderson like metal corpses. The era Cobra was an unusual aircraft. The engine mounted behind the pilot. The drive shaft ran beneath the cockpit. This unconventional layout created space in the nose for something extraordinary. A 37mm Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon that fired through the propeller hub. The M4 could fire 150 rounds per minute from horseshoe-shaped magazines. Muzzle velocity, 2,000 feet per second. The cannon was designed to shred light armor and aircraft fuselages. High explosive rounds, armor-piercing rounds, devastating impact. If you want to see how desperate PT crews turned aircraft wreckage into the most feared weapon in the Solomon Islands, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more untold stories from World War II. Subscribe if you haven't already. Most P-39 wrecks at Henderson were total losses. Engines seized, wings snapped, fuselages crumpled. But the cannons remained intact. Hydraulic recoil systems, belt feed mechanisms, barrel assemblies, everything needed to make them fire. On the morning of November 16th, Lieutenant Jack "Stump" Searles walked through Henderson Field counting wrecks. 19 destroyed Airacobras. Mechanics had already stripped the useful parts: radios, instruments, gauges. Nobody had touched the cannons. They were aircraft weapons. No one imagined mounting them on boats. Until Searles stopped walking. He stood staring at a shattered P-39 with its nose section intact. The 37mm cannon gleamed dully in the tropical sun. His mind made the connection that would change the Pacific War. Henderson Field looked like the end of the world. Shattered aircraft littered the coral runway and muddy taxiways. Burned fuselages sat twisted and blackened. Wing sections lay scattered like broken bones. Shell craters pocked the pierced steel planking. The acrid smell of aviation fuel, scorched rubber, and smoke hung permanent in the tropical air. This was America's most contested airfield in the Pacific. And it was dying one bombing raid at a time. The Japanese hit Henderson almost daily. Betty bombers arrived in perfect formation, 18, sometimes 24 aircraft, escorted by Zeros. Air raid sirens screamed. Marines and sailors scrambled into slit trenches. Bombs walked across the runway. Parked aircraft exploded or collapsed into flames. When the raid ended, mechanics crawled from cover and assessed the damage. Some planes could be patched. Most couldn't. By November 1942, Henderson Field had become an aircraft graveyard. And nowhere was the carnage more visible than among the Bell P-39 Airacobras. The Airacobra was supposed to be a frontline fighter. It wasn't. The P-39 struggled at high altitude where Japanese Zeros dominated. Its Allison engine lost power above 15,000 feet. Pilots called it a flying coffin. But the Army kept sending them anyway. They flew ground attack missions, strafed barges, intercepted low-level bombers. Then they crashed, burned, or simply fell apart from tropical corrosion and mechanical failure. Dozens of wrecked P-39s surrounded Henderson. Some bullet-riddled, some collapsed on blown tires, others crumpled from crash landings. Mechanics had already stripped everything useful: radios, instruments, control cables, seat harnesses. What remained was scrap metal baking under the equatorial sun. But inside those wrecks was something extraordinary. The P-39's design was unconventional. Most fighter aircraft mounted engines in the nose, directly in front of the pilot. Not the Airacobra. Bell aircraft engineers placed the Allison V-1710 engine behind the cockpit. The propeller shaft ran underneath the pilot's seat through a long extension tube. This bizarre configuration created problems: weight distribution issues, overheating, maintenance nightmares. But it also created opportunity. With the engine relocated, the nose was hollow. Bell engineers filled that space with a weapon no other American fighter carried: the Oldsmobile M4 37mm automatic cannon. The barrel protruded through the propeller hub, firing straight down the aircraft's centerline. 30 rounds loaded in horseshoe-shaped magazines. Rate of fire, 150 rounds per minute. Each shell weighed nearly 2 pounds and left the barrel at 2,000 feet per second. The M4 fired 2 types of ammunition. High explosive rounds detonated on impact, shredding aircraft fuselages and light vehicles. Armor-piercing rounds punched through steel plate up to 1 inch thick. Pilots who scored hits described the results as devastating. 1 round could tear a Zero's wing off. 2 rounds could rip through a barge's armor and detonate ammunition stores inside. It was a beautiful weapon. Powerful, reliable, deadly. And right now, 19 of them sat unused in aircraft corpses at Henderson Field. Offshore, PT boat crews were losing. Torpedoes missed. Machine guns failed. Barges slipped through. Every night, the Tokyo Express delivered more troops, more ammunition, more supplies to Japanese forces, slowly strangling Guadalcanal. Inland, the solution sat 3 miles away, gathering rust and coral dust. Nobody had connected the two problems yet. But time was running out. Guadalcanal was hanging by a thread. By November 1942, the Marines had been fighting for 3 months straight. They held Henderson Field and a narrow perimeter around Lunga Point. Everything beyond that, the jungle, the ridges, the rivers, belonged to the Japanese, or to no one. The Marines were exhausted. Malaria ravaged entire companies. Dysentery turned men into skeletons. Rations were cut to 2 meals a day, sometimes 1. Ammunition stocks ran dangerously low. Artillery batteries rationed shells. If the Japanese launched one more major offensive, there was genuine fear the line would break. Everything depended on supply, and supply depended on stopping the Tokyo Express. The Japanese had perfected nighttime resupply. Fast destroyers and cruisers raced down the slot, the channel between islands, under cover of darkness. They unloaded troops and cargo, then vanished before American aircraft could catch them at dawn. When destroyer runs became too costly, Tokyo switched tactics. They sent barges instead. Daihatsu landing, craft, 50 feet long, steel-hulled, powered by diesel engines. Each barge carried 60 troops or 8 tons of supplies. They were slow, barely 12 knots, but nearly invisible to radar. They hugged coastlines, hid in coves during the day, and moved at night when American planes were grounded. The barges worked. Every night, 20 to 30 of them slipped past American defenses. They fed Japanese artillery positions. They delivered fresh troops to replace casualties. They kept enemy forces alive and fighting. Stopping them fell to Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. The PT boats tried. God knows they tried. Every night, wooden hulls screamed across black water at 40 knots, hunting for targets. Crews stood at battle stations for hours, eyes straining against darkness, waiting for the silhouette of a barge against starlight. When they found convoys, they attacked. Torpedoes launched with a hiss and splash. White wakes streaked toward targets, then nothing. The torpedoes dove beneath shallow draft barges and kept running into empty ocean. Japanese gunners returned fire immediately. Type 92 heavy machine guns hammered the night. Tracers arced toward PT boats like chains of fire. The wooden hulls offered no protection. Rounds punched through plywood, through equipment, through men. PT-44 burned off Savo Island on October 9th. 3 crewmen died. PT-37 took machine gun fire during a failed attack on November 2nd. The boat made it back to Tulagi. 2 sailors didn't. PT-61 exploded after a barge scored a lucky hit on a fuel tank. No survivors. Ensign Barney Ross, 23 years old, commanded PT-36. After his 8th failed patrol, he sat on the dock at Tulagi and stared at his hands. They wouldn't stop shaking. "We're racing into gunfights with boats made of plywood and weapons that don't work," he told his exec. "How long before it's our turn to burn?" Commander Alan Montgomery called a meeting of boat captains on November 12th. 15 men crowded into a sweltering Quonset hut. Montgomery didn't sugarcoat it. 73 torpedoes fired at barges since August. 0 confirmed sinks. The barges are getting through, every night. The Marines are running out of time. We're running out of time. He looked at the faces around him, young men aged by fear and failure. "If nothing changes," Montgomery said quietly, "we lose Guadalcanal. And if we lose Guadalcanal, we lose the Pacific." The room fell silent. Nobody had an answer. Not yet. Lieutenant Jack "Stump" Searles wasn't looking for a solution when he walked through Henderson Field on November 16th. He was looking for spark plugs. PT-59's center engine was misfiring. The boat's mechanics swore they could cannibalize parts from wrecked aircraft. "Pilots and boat engines both use Packards," he'd said. Close enough. So Searles walked the graveyard, stepping over twisted metal and shattered plexiglass, checking wreckage for anything useful. He'd been a machinist mate before officer training. He understood engines, hydraulics, mechanical systems. He saw possibilities where others saw scrap. He stopped at a P-39 with its tail section blown off. The nose was intact. The 37mm cannon sat exposed, barrel still straight, recoil housing unmarked. Searles had seen these weapons before, watched them fired during airfield defense drills, heard the deep, authoritative bark that was nothing like a machine gun. He stood there in the heat, staring at the cannon. An idea formed. Impossible. Ridiculous. Unauthorized. What if we put a fighter plane's nose gun on a boat? The thought felt dangerous just thinking it. This wasn't a minor modification. This wasn't swapping out a carburetor or jury-rigging a radio. This was mounting an aircraft weapon, designed for aluminum airframes and hydraulic recoil systems, onto a 20-ton wooden boat that flexed and twisted with every wave. There were no manuals for this, no technical drawings, no Navy approval process that would even consider it. Searles had no engineering degree. He was a 28-year-old machinist from Pittsburgh who'd been promoted to officer because the Navy desperately needed bodies. He walked around the wreck slowly. The cannon weighed maybe 200 pounds with the recoil mechanism. The M4 was fully automatic, 150 rounds per minute. Each shot would produce massive recoil force. PT boats had thin plywood decks over oak frames. One miscalculation, and the first shot would rip through the bow, split the deck, maybe crack the hull. Men could die, his men. But men were already dying. Every night, in boats that couldn't fight back. Searles climbed into the wrecked cockpit. He examined the cannon's mounting system, hydraulic lines, belt feed, charging mechanism. Everything was self-contained. The weapon didn't need the aircraft's electrical system. It just needed power to charge and a trigger to fire. It could work. It might work. He thought about Commander Montgomery's words. If nothing changes, we lose. He thought about PT-44 burning. About the 2 sailors killed on PT-37. About Barney Ross's shaking hands. He thought about Japanese barges moving unmolested every single night, while American torpedoes dove uselessly beneath them. The cannon sat there gleaming dully in the sun, waiting. Searles made his decision. He walked back to Tulagi Base and found Chief Machinist Mate Carl Patterson in the repair shop. Patterson was 41, career Navy, a man who could weld steel underwater and machine parts from memory. "Chief," Searles said, "I need you to look at something crazy." Patterson wiped grease from his hands. "How crazy?" 37mm automatic cannon, aircraft weapon. I want to mount it on PT-59. Patterson stared at him for 5 long seconds. "You got any blueprints?" "No." "Navy approval?" "No." "Engineering calculations?" "No." Patterson grabbed his tool bag. "Then we better get started before someone with common sense stops us." They started before dawn on November 17th. 3 men, Searles, Patterson, and motor machinist mate 2nd class Tony Barone, who'd worked in a Detroit body shop before the war. The P-39 sat canted on collapsed landing gear, nose pointing skyward. Patterson crawled into the cockpit first, flashlight between his teeth, hacksaw in hand. The cannon mounting system was more complex than they'd hoped. The M4 wasn't just bolted in. It was integrated into the aircraft's structure with hydraulic recoil buffers, ammunition feed chutes, charging cables, and a reinforced firewall. "We can't just unbolt this thing," Patterson called out. "We're gonna have to cut it free." They cut for 6 hours straight. Hacksaw through steel mounting brackets, wrench loose hydraulic fittings, disconnect electrical contacts that sparked and smoked. The tropical sun turned the cockpit into an oven. Sweat poured off them. Their hands blistered. Metal shavings embedded in their arms. Barone worked underneath, disconnecting the belt feed mechanism from the aircraft's ammunition bay. The feed system was surprisingly simple. A motorized conveyor that pushed shells from a horseshoe magazine into the breech. As long as they kept the feed motor and magazines intact, the cannon would cycle automatically. "This thing's designed to fire while doing 300 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, Barone said, wrestling a stubborn bolt. "We're going to shoot it from a boat doing 40 knots at sea level. No idea if the recoil system will compensate." "Only one way to find out," Patterson grunted. By 1400 hours, they had the cannon free. 212 pounds of steel, hydraulics, and explosive potential. They loaded it onto a salvage truck and drove to Tulagi. The real work began at the PT boat dock. Patterson had scrounged steel plate from a destroyed Japanese landing craft, quarter-inch armor plating. He welded a crude pedestal mount, working from memory and intuition. No blueprints, no specifications, just his understanding of force, angle, and stress. The mount had to absorb recoil, had to allow traverse and elevation, had to bolt through PT-59's plywood deck into the oak keel beams without cracking the hull structure. Searles and Barone drilled mounting holes through the foredeck. The drill bit punched through 3/4-inch plywood, then bit into solid white oak. They drilled 4 holes, then 6, then 8. Through bolts every 4 inches, each one torqued until the wood groaned. Patterson lowered the cannon onto the pedestal mount. The weight pressed the bow down visibly. He welded the cannon to the steel base, his torch casting orange light across dark water. Sparks showered into the Pacific and hissed into nothing. They worked through the night. By 0600 on November 18th, the cannon was mounted. Ammunition magazines loaded with 30 rounds of armor-piercing shells. Charging handle pulled back, safety engaged. PT-59 sat low in the water, bow weighted down by a weapon it was never designed to carry. Searles stood on the dock staring at their work. The cannon looked simultaneously menacing and absurd, a fighter plane's nose gun bolted to plywood and hope. "If this works," Barone said quietly, "we just changed the war." "If it doesn't work," Patterson added, "we just killed ourselves." Nobody slept that day. That night, they would find out. PT-59 left Tulagi Harbor at 2130 hours on November 18, 1942. No test firing, no practice runs, no calibration. The cannon sat on the bow like a loaded question. Untested, unproven, possibly lethal to everyone aboard. Searles stood at the wheel. Patterson manned the cannon. Barone and 4 other crewmen took positions at the twin 50 caliber machine guns. The center Packard engine still misfired occasionally, coughing black smoke into the night. They never did find those spark plugs. Intelligence reported a barge convoy moving south past Savo Island. 8 to 10 Daihatsus carrying ammunition and reinforcements. The same route. The same enemy. The same mission PT boats had failed at dozens of times before, except tonight was different. The sea was rough, 4-foot swells rolling in from the east. PT-59 crashed through waves, bow rising and slamming down. Every impact sent shudders through the hull. The cannon mount groaned with each landing. Searles watched Patterson brace himself against the weapon. checking welds with his hands, feeling for cracks. "How's it holding?" Searles called over engine noise. "Ask me after we fire it," Patterson shouted back. They ran dark. No lights, no radio traffic. Just the scream of engines and the crash of water. The crew was silent. Everyone understood what was at stake. If the mount failed, if the deck cracked, if recoil tore through the hull below the waterline, they'd sink in minutes. In these waters, Japanese-controlled waters, rescue was unlikely. At 23:18, the radar operator called out, "Contacts, 2 miles, multiple targets." Searles throttled down. The engines quieted to a predatory rumble. Through binoculars, he saw them. Dark shapes against darker water. Barges moving in column formation. He counted 6. "Battle stations." His voice sounded steadier than he felt. PT-59 turned toward the convoy. Searles advanced the throttles. 20 knots, 30, 40. The boat lifted onto plane, hull skimming across swells. Distance closed rapidly. 1 mile, half mile. Japanese gunners opened fire first. Tracers arced toward them, red streams of death stitching the darkness. Rounds cracked past the hull heights. One punched through the port gunwale. "Patterson!" Searles screamed. "Now!" Patterson pulled the trigger. The world exploded. The cannon's bark was nothing like a machine gun. It was deeper, violent, a physical force that slammed through chest and bone. Recoil drove the mount backward. The deck flexed downward visibly. Wood groaned. For one terrible instant, Searles thought the bow would tear apart. Then the cannon cycled. The breech mechanism clattered, another shell chambered. Patterson held the trigger down. Boom, boom, boom. Shells streaked across black water at 2,000 feet per second. The first round hit a barge amidships. Steel plate punctured. The armor-piercing shell detonated inside the cargo hold. The barge erupted in orange flame. Patterson traversed left. Fired again. A second barge exploded, ammunition cooking off in rapid secondary blasts. Burning fuel spread across water. Japanese soldiers dove overboard, silhouettes against fire. The other barges scattered in panic. Engines roared as they fled. PT-59 pursued. Patterson fired in short bursts now. 5 rounds, traverse, 5 more rounds. Every shell found its target. Wood splintered, steel tore, men died. In 90 seconds, 4 barges were burning or sinking. Searles pulled back, engines screaming as they retreated into darkness. Return fire chased them, but fell short. The Japanese were shooting at ghosts. When they were clear, Searles throttled down. Silence fell over PT-59. Just the idle rumble of engines and the crackle of distant irons. Patterson stood at the cannon, hands still gripping the weapon, staring back at the destruction. "Jesus Christ," Barone whispered. "It worked." Searles looked at his crew. Their faces showed the same expression. Not relief, not joy. Power. For the first time since August, they weren't helpless. Patterson turned from the cannon. His voice was quiet but certain. "This changes everything." By noon on November 19th, every PT boat crew at Tulagi knew. They'd seen PT-59 return at dawn with an empty cannon magazine, burn marks on the bow, and 4 confirmed barge kills. Word spread through the base like wildfire. Mechanics, radio men, cooks, commanders, everyone gathered at the dock to see the weapon that had finally worked. Lieutenant Barney Ross touched the cannon barrel. Still warm. He looked at Searles. "I want one." "Get in line," said the commander of PT-37. By that afternoon, crews were stripping Henderson Field like scavengers. Mechanics crawled into every P-39 wreck with cutting torches and hacksaws. Within 3 days, 11 more cannons arrived at Tulagi. Chief Patterson and his welders worked around the clock. Steel pedestals took shape. Mounting bolts drilled through decks. By November 25th, 6 PT boats carried 37mm cannons. Navy Command at Noumea received Searles's after-action report on November 20th. The initial response was bureaucratic outrage, unauthorized weapons modification, violation of Navy regulations, safety protocols ignored. Then came the second report, and the third, and the fourth. PT-59, 4 barges destroyed. PT-36, 3 barges sunk, 1 damaged. PT-48, 2 barges destroyed, convoy scattered. PT-61, 5 barges sunk in a single engagement. The outrage turned to silence, then interest, then urgent requests for technical specifications. By December, official Navy engineers arrived to study Patterson's improvised mounts. By January 1943, standardized 37mm mounts were in production stateside. New PT boats rolled off assembly line with reinforced bows and factory-installed cannons. What began as unauthorized field modification became official doctrine. But doctrine couldn't capture what happened on the water. PT boats had always been fast. Now they were lethal. They hunted Japanese barges with predatory efficiency. Cannon-armed boats worked in pairs, one to illuminate with searchlights, one to destroy. Barges that once moved boldly now hugged coastlines, paralyzed by fear. Convoys scattered at the sound of Packard engines. The Japanese noticed. A captured enemy report dated December 12, 1942, translated by Navy intelligence, contained a phrase that would become legendary. American Devil boats attack with cannon fire. Armor provides no protection. Barges are destroyed before crews can return effective fire. Request immediate tactical changes to counter Devil boat threat. Another report, intercepted in January 1943, called them Green Dragons, a reference to the boat's camouflage paint and their ability to emerge from darkness, strike with devastating fire, and vanish. Japanese barge crews began refusing missions. Some convoys turned back rather than risk the run past Guadalcanal. Supply operations that once happened nightly became sporadic, desperate affairs. The Tokyo Express was derailing. At Tulagi, the change in morale was palpable. Crews who'd once left harbor expecting failure now left expecting kills. The tally boards at the operations hut filled with confirmed sinks. Numbers that had been 0 for months suddenly climbed into double digits. Ensign Ross, whose hands had shaken after his 8th failed patrol, commanded PT-36 during a night engagement on December 3rd. His boat destroyed 3 barges in 4 minutes. When he returned to base, he stood on the dock looking at his cannon, and his hands were steady. "I'm not afraid anymore," he told Searles. "For the first time since August, I'm not afraid." Lieutenant Commander Montgomery gathered his boat captains on December 10th, the same men who'd sat in stunned silence 4 weeks earlier, when he'd said, "If nothing changes, we lose." He didn't need to say anything this time. They'd changed everything. The Devil boats were hunting. On January 15th, 1943, the Bureau of Ships issued Technical Bulletin 43A, installation of 37mm automatic cannon on motor torpedo boats. What Lieutenant Jack Searles and Chief Patterson had welded together from aircraft wreckage and desperation was now official United States Navy equipment. Engineering firms received contracts. Standardized mounts went into production, reinforced pedestals designed specifically for PT boat hull structures. The mounts distributed recoil force across wider sections of deck, reducing stress on individual frames. They allowed 360-degree traverse and 60-degree elevation. They were professional, tested, safe, but they were based entirely on Patterson's improvised design. The Navy went further. Oldsmobile's M4 aircraft cannon worked, but engineers saw room for improvement. They developed the M9 37mm automatic cannon, purpose-built for naval use. Heavier barrel, improved cooling, better suited for sustained fire in salt air environments. Rate of fire increased to 180 rounds per minute. By March 1943, new PT boats left Elko and Higgins shipyards with 37mm cannons already installed. By summer, retrofit kits shipped to every PT boat squadron in the Pacific and Mediterranean. The weapon spread like a virus. Solomon Island squadrons had proven the concept. Now it expanded across 2 oceans. In New Guinea, PT boats equipped with 37mm cannons decimated Japanese barge traffic along the northern coast. Convoys attempting to reinforce Lae and Salamaua were shredded in night ambushes. Japanese garrisons began starving. In the Philippines, cannon-armed PT boats controlled coastal waters around Mindanao. Enemy supply operations collapsed. Japanese commanders filed reports describing catastrophic losses to American fast attack craft with heavy automatic weapons. Even the Mediterranean saw devil boats. PT squadrons operating from Malta and North Africa mounted 37mm cannons and hunted German and Italian supply vessels. The tactics that worked against Japanese barges worked just as well against Axis coastal traffic. Small enemy vessels, F-lighters, Seabull ferries, armed trawlers learned to fear the night. The strategic impact was undeniable. Between November 1942 and August 1943, cannon-armed PT boats destroyed over 400 Japanese barges in the Solomon Islands alone. Each barge represented 60 troops or 8 tons of supplies that never reached enemy lines. Japanese ground offensives faltered. Artillery ran out of ammunition. Reinforcements never arrived. The Tokyo Express, once unstoppable, became a death sentence. But statistics don't capture what mattered most to the men who fought. Motor machinist mate Tony Barone, who'd helped install the first cannon on PT-59, survived the war. He commanded his own boat by 1944. Before the cannons, every patrol felt like suicide, he said in a post-war interview. After, we still faced danger, but we had a fighting chance. That's all sailors ever ask for. Casualties dropped. Between August and October 1942, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 lost 9 boats and 23 men. Between November 1942 and March 1943, after cannons were installed, they lost 2 boats and 4 men, despite running twice as many patrols. Ensign Barney Ross, whose hands had shaken with fear, made it home to Pennsylvania in 1945. He kept a photograph of PT-36 with its 37mm cannon mounted on the bow. On the back, he'd written, "The weapon that let us fight back." Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery received the Navy Cross for leadership during the Guadalcanal campaign. He never mentioned the medal. He talked about the cannons. Desperate men did something unauthorized and saved lives, he said. That's the real story. By August 1945, the war was ending. PT boats had fought from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, from North Africa to the Philippines. They'd evolved far beyond their original torpedo boat design. Most carried 37mm or 40mm automatic cannons. Some mounted rockets. Others carried radar. But the transformation had begun on a single November night in 1942 when an unauthorized weapon fired its first shot. The Devil boats had become legendary. Japanese war records, captured and translated after surrender, revealed the psychological devastation these boats caused. An Imperial Navy report from February 1943 stated, Fast attack boats equipped with automatic cannon represent the most significant threat to coastal supply operations. Barge crews suffer severe morale deterioration. Mission completion rates have fallen below 40%. Another document, dated June 1944, recommended abandoning daylight and twilight barge operations entirely due to American devil boat superiority in night combat. The enemy had learned to fear them. Post-war analysis by the Navy's Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed what sailors already knew. Cannon-armed PT boats had destroyed over 800 enemy vessels, barges, landing craft, coastal freighters, armed trawlers. They'd disrupted supply lines across 2 theaters. They'd supported amphibious operations from Sicily to Leyte Gulf. But statistics can't measure innovation born from desperation. What happened at Henderson Field in Tulagi in November 1942 wasn't just tactical adaptation. It was a fundamental reimagining of what was possible. Lieutenant Jack Searles and Chief Carl Patterson didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for engineering studies or official approval. They saw a problem, recognized a solution, and had the courage to break every rule to make it happen. They weren't the only ones. Across the Pacific, soldiers and sailors improvised constantly, mounting weapons on vehicles, modifying equipment, inventing solutions that no manual anticipated. War forced ingenuity. Desperation bred innovation. But the devil boats stood out because the innovation worked so spectacularly well that it became doctrine. Think about that. An unauthorized battlefield modification, welded together from aircraft wreckage by 3 men with hacksaws and hope, became standard equipment for the United States Navy. That doesn't happen unless the solution is undeniable. These boats were wooden. 80 feet of plywood and mahogany held together with screws and glue. They burned when hit. They broke apart in heavy seas. They were fragile, expendable, temporary. Their crews were mortal. Young men, most under 30, who volunteered for dangerous duty in boats that offered no armor and little chance of survival if things went wrong. Their solution was improvised. No blueprints, no testing, no safety margins. Just hands-on engineering, calculated risk, and absolute necessity. But they changed history. They turned the tide at Guadalcanal. They disrupted enemy supply chains across the Pacific. They proved that speed, firepower, and courage could overcome size and armor. They gave hope to sailors who'd been losing and fear to an enemy who'd thought themselves safe. The devil boats earned their name, and it all started with a simple question, asked by a lieutenant staring at wreckage in a tropical graveyard. What if we put a fighter's nose gun on a boat? Sometimes the right question, asked at the right moment, changes everything. If you enjoyed this story of innovation and courage in World War II, please like this video and subscribe for more untold history. Drop a comment below. What other improvised weapons or battlefield innovations should we cover next? Thanks for watching. Remember the devil boats.